And now we're going to shift gears because we're going to do some reading. Normally what I do in a face-to-face class is I have the students take kind of round robin turns reading. Obviously can't do that. So I'm going to do the reading. It's best if you have the text in front of you. My students have the special edition from my college of Louis Poyman's second edition, Classics of Philosophy. That is, however, available exclusively to students at my college through the bookstore. But it is simply a condensation, a selection, not condensation, of the same volume, volume 2 of Louis Poyman's book. And I won't bother here with the details, but if you look at the notes for the YouTube video that we're watching now, you'll see there's an ISBN number, and one can order it. Used copies go for as little as $2, so it's very readily available. But it's a good book to have. Generally, it has not only the text we're going to do here, but it has, in some cases, the entirety of some very major philosophical texts. So it's a good thing to have for $2 in your personal library. Okay, the Presocratics. Presocratics are going to be difficult, more difficult than philosophers usually are, for reasons we'll explore momentarily. The last reading we're going to do in this course is going to be from Hegel's Phenomenology, which is possibly the most difficult text ever. I don't know, one of the most. These are difficult, though, for different sort of reasons. Not intrinsically difficult, but we'll see why. Okay, but let's talk a little bit about philosophy in literary form, because that's ultimately why they are going to be difficult. If you're a philosopher, you probably imagine that your thoughts are for the ages, and you want to write them down, and most philosophers have done this, with a notable exception. There are a number of options by which one can do this. One of them is drama or dialogue. Plato is the most notable person who does this, but Hume also does it. Dialogues concerning natural religion, Jean-Paul Sartre, No Exit in his plays and so forth, does dramatize philosophy. Plato's dialogues could be staged. Now, Socrates gets all the interesting parts and the other guy gets the boring parts. He's kind of second banana. Well, oh yes, Socrates, what you say is true, you know. But they are a back and forth, and they could indeed be dramatized. Another literary form is a list of theses. Peter Lombard's Sentences in the Middle Ages, we talked about this in the first lecture. It was a major work of the time. Karl Marx, closer to our own time, wrote 11 Theses on Feuerbach. Very pithy, you know, basically assertions without a lot of argument behind them. Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus is like this, as well as other writings by Wittgenstein. Related to the list of theses is the form of the aphorism. Nietzsche is the master of this. The novel. Jean-Paul Sartre's first philosophical work wasn't his Being and Nothingness, which is a standard treatise, an essay, long essay, but it was Nausea, a novel. Iris Murdoch's very good at this. She used to be a tutor up at St. Anne's until she started making a lot of money writing novels, and did that exclusively. But she is a philosopher among novelists and a moral philosopher. You can learn a lot about ethics by reading the novels of Iris Murdoch. And then there's the essay form. This is by far the most common and the preferred form. Some philosophers would look at someone like Nietzsche or Sartre or even Wittgenstein and say, listen, these guys are not real philosophers because they don't lay out arguments at length. You know, they simply make assertions. They don't go through the whole process of thinking it through. The essay form, whether or not, by the way, the people that say that are correct or not, I tend to think they're not. But that the essay form certainly lends itself to doing that sort of linear discursive presentation. And again, most philosophers use that form. So if you look at Locke's essay concerning human understanding, Descartes' Meditations, Hume's inquiry concerning human understanding, Kant's various works, Being and Nothingness by Sartre, I mentioned before, Karl Popper's Logic of Scientific Discovery, and one can mention tons and tons and tons of others. Most philosophers have written works of this sort. Now we come to the problem for us, which is fragments. This is not a form of choice, but it's the form in which we're able to read whatever we have of the pre-Socratic philosophers. And this is a general problem with all ancient texts. Here, for example, Empedocles, one of the pre-Socratic philosophers, this is what the texts often look like. Fragments, little bits of papyrus that one then has to piece together. Of course, most of this work has been done a long time ago. This was a task of 19th century scholars for the most part, establishing the best text we can of the ancients, and we've done that to the best of our ability a long time ago. I may have mentioned to you that for the longest time I had a day job with the public schools. I love to teach philosophy, but it doesn't pay, and it's like a musician's gig. You've got to have a day job in order to support your craft, if craft is indeed what I'm doing here. And so one day I was walking across the campus of my day job, and I saw these little fragments blowing across the quad, and so I picked them up. And I think of them as the codex fragments from Tel La. Tel La was a settlement in Southern California in the early Trump dynasty and before. In archaeology, a tell is an artificial mound formed when mud brick dwellings basically kind of collapsed. And it's a place archaeologists will search out because that's where people live. That's where they're going to find artifacts. And so Tel La, from the late 20th, early 21st centuries. Sometimes called el pueblo de Nuestra Señora de la Reina de los Ángeles del Río de Porciuncula. These are strange things. There on the left is a Greek papyrus codex from Egypt. There on the right is the codex Tel La. These fragments seem to be from some religious text, I would gather. One page has a title. It has the name of a saint, which is a religious title. There are chapter headings and verses are numbered. Other fragments have the same sort of numbering, but the titles and headings have been lost. So one wonders, first of all, are they from the same book? Are they from different books? And the purple, well, why is some of the text in purple? What does that mean? A future classical scholar, if he were presented with these fragments, would have to do a lot of guesswork. There's some internal evidence, particularly there's a mention of a character named Jesus. He comes up again and again that connects them, but were these part of a larger work? How large was it? Who wrote it? Was it written by an individual or by a committee? Furthermore, if it was a religious text, how was it used? Was its audience limited to a small priesthood that could read, or could it be read by a wider audience of laymen? How, if at all, was it related to ritual or worship? If you go to synagogue every Shabbos, there's a scroll with the Torah, and it's unrolled a little bit every week. And you start at the beginning of the year at the beginning, and you read through the entire year. It's a real honor to do this. It's a central feature of Shabbos service. Is that how these texts were used, or were they used in a different way? And again, we know from our religions in the Protestant Reformation, making religious texts available to the laity in their own languages, that was a big issue. Previously, scripture had been in the scholarly language Latin, not translated into the various vernaculars, French, German, English, and so forth. And it was available only to the priests. They read aloud selected passages in worship. The Protestants, though, wanted the laity to be able to read their scriptures whenever they wanted to, outside of worship even. And this led to a lot of conflict. There were people burned at the stake, lots of martyrs, et cetera, et cetera. Now, you wouldn't know this from looking at the text itself. So there's a whole bunch of potential history underlying the text and its uses. And if we can assume that this is indeed a religious text, Jesus and St. Matthew and so forth, how was it used? You just can't read that off the text itself. If you don't have independent information, a lot of the text is going to be a mystery. Text needs context. In other words, texts alone don't provide their own context. Now, think about this. If all we had from the religious life of Tel La in the early 21st, late 20th centuries were snippets like this, it would be very difficult to reconstruct a larger picture to say what religious life was like for these people. But this is exactly the problem that classical scholars face all the time. And it is acutely a problem with our situation here with the pre-Socratic philosophers, not a religious situation, but one that has a similar textual problem. Somebody once asked Winston Churchill if he was worried about his place in history. He says, no, because I'm going to write it, which indeed he did. 6 volumes, for example, on the Second World War. The victor writes history, okay? Had Hitler won, the story of Churchill would be read, I think, rather differently. Think about King Ahab and his queen Jezebel, you know? When we say of a woman, she's a Jezebel, that's not a sign of approval. And it doesn't mean that she shoplifts at the A&P. She's a Jezebel. She's a wicked woman, right? Well, according to historians, Ahab and Jezebel were not such bad rulers, but their enemies who wrote their story came down in the scriptures in Tanakh, and that's the story we know. Now, imagine that if you were like Jezebel and all anyone knew of you 2,800 years from now was a letter written by your worst enemy. It's a lovely day for a bonfire, yours. Or imagine if all we knew of George Washington was some secondhand hearsay repeated over the past 2 centuries, how George Washington fleeced the nation. Now imagine that all that remained of the last 200 years of American history, George Washington onward, let's say, fit between the covers of 1 or 2 slim books. This is only slightly different from the situation we face for 200 years of philosophy before Socrates came along, the Presocratics, as we call them. So, first of all, what remains of the Presocratics is so very fragmentary. I mentioned that the texts have been assembled a long time ago, from 1903 onward. Diels and Krantz compiled the surviving fragments into a standard edition, Testimonia ipsissima verba, and Imitations, the 3 categories. Kirkraven and Schofield is the English version of that. There are, of course, very big gaps and also inconsistencies. We'll see that. What Aristotle says about Thales seems not to comport with what we know about Thales as the guy who predicted the first eclipse. And there's usually no primary source against which we can check these things. They are all we have to go on. Secondly, what remains of the Presocratics is secondhand and often centuries removed. Much of what we have is filtered through Aristotle. Aristotle had access to sources that no longer exist, so we can't check his use of the sources. Then there were folks like Pseudo-Plutarch in the Christian era, very, very much farther removed from the originals. Which is why Bertrand Russell tells us, and I think this is worth paying attention to, when one thinks what would become of any modern philosopher if he were only known through the polemics of his rivals, one can see how admirable the Presocratics must have been, since even in the midst of malice spread by their enemies, they still appear great. One of the notable things about which the Presocratics talk is nature. Well, nature, we all understand what that is, right? However, we are such beneficiaries of what my friend Eric Price called packed down science, that is, science translated into ordinary common sense. It's only with effort that we can imagine what nature must have looked like to people in the past, such as ancient Greeks, before they really developed initially that very concept of nature, which has now been packed down and transmitted to us, which we all take for granted. So to do a little thought experiment, try remembering when you were a child, when it seemed plausible that magic words could do things, abracadabra, or that an old man in a sleigh with reindeer could fly around the world on Christmas Eve and deliver presents to every little kid. Yeah, it was a very different way of looking at life, I think, that we have in adulthood. I remember hearing the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, and I thought, oh, gee, I looked at my backyard. If I could just find some of those beans, I could grow a beanstalk and climb up into the heavens like Jack did. I was almost born in Japan. My mother came back about 2 months before I was born. And so I was born in the United States. But I had a Japanese godmother, and she would send me things. She sent me a little hoppy coat. It's a little Japanese child's garment, and sent me a record of Japanese folk tales in English. And one of them was Momotaro, Little Peach Boy. And the story is there's an old couple. They can't have children. If you think about the story of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, we'll come back to that a little later down the road. This is kind of similar to that. But she goes out looking for something for his supper, and she sees this ginormous peach floating down the stream. So she snags it, takes it home, cuts it open, and guess what? there's a little boy inside. He emerges from the peach, and they adopt him as their son. He becomes a great hero, and so the story goes. And I thought, wow, maybe mom and dad found me in a peach too. Of course, witches can fly. I hope they don't get me. The Wizard of Oz, back in the days when there wasn't a lot of repertoire to keep running on TV. This ran every year, at least once. Icarus, he could fly, and magic carpets, Aladdin and all that. Wow, that's cool. So try remembering what it was like when you were 4 years old. You didn't know any science, magic could happen. Then imagine asking yourself this: how did we come to see how did the world we see come to be arranged as it is? At the center of the earth with its great masses of water and the hollow seas, round it the airy region of mist and cloud and rain, and beyond that, the heavenly fires. And you'll get a sense of what things were like for the Presocratics. Now, furthermore, imagine trying to answer these questions not in terms of the gods, the Olympians, the Titans, the mythological figures, etc., which is how most cultures, and the Greeks do indeed do address these questions, but try to address them in terms of the very natural processes you see at work in nature every day. And here you have the difference that the early Presocratic inquiry made. Thunder and lightning is no longer the thunderbolts thrown by Zeus. There's something else going on there. At the same time, the Presocratics set a pattern that would continue for quite a long era, asking empirical questions. That's what they first started to do, but then giving these wild ad hoc, non-empirical answers to them. The sort of thing we talked about Bacon and Aristotle and the new organon, the old organon, the sort of thing that Bacon would find just so irritating in his own day. What if I told you I'm just making shit up as I go along? That's what they were doing. On the other hand, given the state of technology at the time, it's hard to imagine how they might have done otherwise. They had to make a start somewhere. And it's to their credit, I think, that they at least asked the right questions. Even if they lacked the adequate means to answer those questions, they got the ball rolling. What does Einstein say? If I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would use the first 55 minutes determining the proper question to ask, and then 5 minutes to answer it. They determined the nature of the questions. So do hang in there. What the Presocratics say is going to strike you, trust me, as weird and incomprehensible. This is not the same thing as saying unimportant, though. Incidentally, the contrast with the Presocratics appears great when we consider Newtonian physics from the 17th century onward. But quantum physics from the 20th century is really weird, and it sounds more and more like what the Presocratics were saying on some themes. Here's an interesting treatment. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but here's a physicist who looks into the comparisons between modern physical theory and that of the Presocratics. There are some interesting parallels and indeed even perhaps repetitions. All right, let's go to the Presocratics. Here are the three main areas we need to think about. Athens in the center, that's where philosophy is going to go eventually at the end of the Presocratic period. But it begins in two other places. First of all, in Ionia, we've talked about that a little earlier, Colophon, Ephesus, and of course Miletus, where Thales was from, some of his other colleagues. Also, Aelia, or Magna Graecia as it's called, what we would now regard as Italy, the boot bit of Italy, and also Sicily in that area, and some other places, Abder and Chios as well. But we're going to start with the Ionians and then look at the Eleatics a bit, and then see how both of these currents gravitate eventually to Athens. Okay, that's basically what I just said. The Ionians, first of all. The Milesians were first and foremost among them. Not only Thales, but Anaximander and Anaximenes also. That's the big city for Presocratic philosophy, Athens, of course, for later philosophy. So let's look at Thales. Here he is on a stamp. The Greeks are so proud of their boys, Name me three things the Greeks gave to civilization, if you know the movie. I think that Greek wedding. Thales was one of the seven sages. Here's a mosaic depicting him in that fashion. Socrates also, and some others. Let's see what Thales has to say first of all. So, if you have If you have my college edition, we're going to start the numbers for the special edition are the large numbers at the bottom of the page, but most of you, I think, if you're following in a textbook, are going to have the full second edition. Those are the numbers at the top of our special edition. So this is page 10 in special edition, but it's page 12 if you have the full edition. And I'll read starting at the top of the first column. Of the first philosophers, the majority thought the sources of all things were found only in the class of matter. For that of which all existing things consist, and that from which they come to be first, and into which they perish last, the substance continuing but changing its properties, this, they say, is the element and source of existing things. Accordingly, they do not think that anything either comes to be or perishes, inasmuch as this nature is always preserved. For there is a certain nature, either one or more than one, from which everything else comes to be while this is preserved. All, however, do not agree on the number and character of this source. But Thales, the originator of this kind of theory, says it is water, and that is why he asserts that the earth floats on water. Perhaps getting this conception from observing that everything derives its nourishment from what is moist, and that the hot itself arises from and lives off it. The hot itself, hold that thought, the way in which the ancients conceived of heat and cold. The hot itself arises from and lives off it, and the thing from which the hot comes to be is the source of everything else. He gets his conception both from the fact and from this fact and from the fact that the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and also the fact that water is the principle of growth for moist things. And this comes from Aristotle, who again is several centuries removed. The second passage, Thales of Miletus, one of the 7 wise men, 7 sages, is said to have been the first to pursue natural philosophy. He said the beginning and the end of the world was water. For from this the world is composed, and when it is condensed and in turn dissolved, and the world is born on it. From it come earthquakes, windstorms, and the motions of the heavenly bodies. And things of the world travel and flow as they are carried around by the nature of the first agent of their coming to be. And this is God, which has neither beginning nor end. By occupying himself with the study and explanation of the heavenly bodies, Thales became the founder of astronomy among the Greeks. And this is from Hippolytus, that is to say, Saint Hippolytus, who was early 3rd century, well into the Christian era, rather quite removed, much more distantly removed than Aristotle even. And then the last passage. It appears from what is recounted of him that Thales too understood the soul to be a source of motion, since he said the lodestone magnet has a soul because it moves iron. Some say that soul is mixed in the universe, and this is perhaps the reason Thales said, all things are full of gods. And this again is Aristotle. So, Thales of Miletus, things of the world travel and flow as they are carried around by the nature of the first agent of their coming to be, and this is God. So says St. Hippolytus. Well, we've come across this idea before, haven't we? This is Aristotle's idea of the prime mover, which Aristotle himself, of course, did not take in a religious direction, but which plenty of religious people, Christians and others, have been quite happy to do so, including here St. Hippolytus. The uncaused cause prime mover argument. Hippolytus credits Thales with this. That seems perhaps rather unlikely, although one can see why, again, Hippolytus being a Christian saint might be so inclined. And Aristotle says this of Thales. Thales said the lodestone magnet has a soul because it moves iron. This is perhaps the reason Thales said all things are full of gods. Aristotle seems to think that Thales was an animist, but recall Thales' prediction of the eclipse. The whole point of predicting the eclipse, why do we remember Thales for doing that, is that he gave a major alternative to the animist notion that there are spirits and demons contending, and that's how we have to explain nature. That rather we can think of nature as a category in itself, which can be explained in its own terms. That's Thales' big contribution. And in Aristotle, this seems to be lost on him. Thales also discovered that amber, if rubbed against cat fur, would attract feathers. Amber, the word for amber in Greek is elektron, which is where we get our word electron. He concluded that amber, like lodestones, was also alive. But this is difficult to square this all things are full of God's business with Herodotus' report of the eclipse and Thales having predicted it. A skeptic walks into the room. Did Thales say all things are full of gods? Did Thales predict the eclipse? Can these both be true? John Burnett has an explanation of this, not to make too much of this all things full of gods, etc. It's just an apothegm, and probably attributed to Thales as one of the 7 wise men, rather than being something that Thales actually said. Although he thinks, Burnett also, that it's probable that Thales thought that magnet and amber had souls. This is on the level with the statement that Earth floats on water, but not necessarily implying a general sort of animism. Okay, so one could argue that. You know, people make up quotations about famous guys all the time. What did Abraham Lincoln say? The problem with the internet is that you can't always depend on their accuracy. That's what's stated there. And of course, there's a whole history of misquotes. Churchill gets attributed lots of quotes that he should have said but didn't. To say that the magnet and amber are alive, says Burnett, is to imply, if anything, that other things are not. So it may not indeed be a general sort of animism. And did Thales even predict the eclipse? One can argue that. I won't read this to you, but you can stop. You can pause or go back and read it when you get the handout. The main thing is commentaries on the Presocratics, as we've just seen, are some centuries removed. Aristotle is a couple of centuries after, the Christians are many centuries after, and the Christians were not always friendly toward pagan thought. Remember what Russell said about your enemies writing the story. Imagine someone trying to tell the story of Charlemagne based only on hearsay 1,000 years later. Ever played the game Telephone, right, where you pass a secret around a circle and it comes back? It's not the same secret when it goes around even a circle of 8 or 10 people at a party. Well, there's room for distortion there. Thales says the source of everything is water, and that is why he asserts that the earth floats on water. Nietzsche had the following commentary. Greek philosophy seems to begin with a preposterous idea, with the proposition that water is the origin and mother womb of all things. Is it really necessary to stop there and become serious? Yes, and for 3 reasons. Firstly, because the proposition does enunciate something about the origin of things. Secondly, because it does so without figure and fable, no gods involved there. Thirdly, and lastly, because it's contained, though, because it is contained, though only in the chrysalis state, the idea everything is one. The first reason leaves Thales still in the company of the religious and superstitious people. However, the second takes him out of this company and shows him to us as a natural philosopher, but by virtue of the third, he becomes the first Greek philosopher. Okay, Anaximander. Anaximander, also from Miletus, reputed to be a pupil and follower of Thales, offers some specific physical explanations as well. Again, these are off base for us, but maybe he gets points for effort. Let's read Anaximander. First passage. Of those who say the principle is one and in motion and boundless, Anaximander, the son of Praxiades of Miletus, the successor and student of Thales, said the source and element of existing things was the boundless, apeion, being the first one to apply this term to the source. And he says it is neither water nor any of the so-called elements, but some other boundless or indefinite nature, from which comes to be all the heavens and the world orders in them. From what things existing objects come to be, to them too does their destruction take place according to what must be, for they give recompense and pay restitution to each other for their injustice according to the ordinance of time, using these rather poetic terms. So says Simplicius, and he was early 6th century Common Era. Second passage. After Thales, Anaximander, who was his companion, said the boundless contained the whole cause of coming to be and perishing of the world, from which he says the heavens are separated and generally all the world orders which are countless. And he declared perishing to take place and much earlier coming to be, and all these recurring from an infinite time past. So there's your question about can the regress go back infinitely? Aristotle said no. Apparently Anaximander says yes. He says, Anaximander, says the earth is cylindrical in shape and its depth is 1/3 of its width. He says that that part of the everlasting which is generative of hot and cold, here we go again, separated off for the coming to be of the world order, and from this a sort of sphere of flame grew around the earth like about the earth like bark around a tree. This subsequently broke off and was closed into individual circles to form the sun, the moon, and the stars. He also says that in the beginning, man was generated from animals of a different species, namely fish, inferring this from the fact that other animals come quickly to eat on their own, while man needs to be nursed for a long time. For this reason, man would never have survived if he had originally had his present form. And this comes from Pseudo-Plutarch, late 3rd, early 4th centuries, again of the Common Era. And the last passage about Anaximander. The earth is suspended, supported by nothing, staying there because it maintains equal distance from everything. Its shape is concave round like a column drum. We walk on one of its surfaces, and there is another surface opposite. The heavenly bodies are circles of fire, separated from the cosmic fire surrounded by air. There are certain flute-like passages for breathing holes through which the heavenly bodies appear. Accordingly, when the holes are blocked, there are eclipses. The moon appears to be waxing and waning by turns according to whether the passages are being blocked or opened. The circle of the sun is 27 times that of the earth, and that of the moon 18 times. The sun is the highest body, and the lowest of the circles of the fixed stars. Living creatures arose from the moist being evaporated by the sun. In the beginning, man was similar to a different kind of animal, namely a fish. Winds come to be from the lightest of vapors of air, which are separated off and moving after being gathered, and rains from the vapor drawn up from the things under the sun. Here the text is corrupt. We don't quite know where it goes. Lightning occurs when wind, as it breaks out of the clouds, rends them. He, Anaximander, was born in the 3rd year of the 42nd Olympiad, that is the year 610 before the Common Era. That's the Greek frickin' time. And this is again by St. Hippolytus, early 3rd century of the Common Era. Okay, the aperon, the boundless. This is the origin of all things for Anaximander. Now, Thales conceived of the origin in terms of material stuff. It was water for Thales, but Anaximander says it's not stuff, it's a principle, not something material, but something different. So Anaximander was also the first to have a broadly developed philosophy, a system of cosmology, of physics, an account of animals, and an account of knowledge. We've seen some of those elements kind of all wrapped into one. Okay, does change happen? Karl Popper says this. In an interesting essay, by the way, called Back to the Pre-Socratics, and this is addressed to the Aristotelian Society in 1958. It's worth reading. For Anaximander, our own world, our own cosmic edifice, was only one of an infinity of worlds, an infinity without bounds in space and time. The infinity of worlds was eternal, and so was motion. There was thus no need to offer a general theory of change. Change is just so wrapped up in the basic conception. Not only can things become, they can pass away too. And they've been doing this for an infinite time. There's infinite regress, no beginning. And motion is also a fact. Hold that thought, because some are going to deny that. Anaximander said the boundless contained the whole cause of coming to be and perishing of the world, and he declared perishing to take place and much earlier coming to be, all of these recurring from an infinite time past. Later philosophers are going to take issue with this. Parmenides, for example, we'll come to him, thought that coming to be and perishing were both impossible. There is no becoming, there's no motion either, but everything is as it has been and as it must be. And Aristotle, of course, we know already, is going to dispute that time is infinite in the way Anaximander says. There has to be, says Aristotle, a first cause. But Anaximander doesn't think so. He also seems to think that there's some kind of cosmic principle of natural justice at work. The Greeks had this as a kind of folk belief. Here's Adike, the goddess of justice, beating Adike, the goddess of injustice, like a stepchild. That justice was sort of knit into the fabric of the cosmos. And lots of cultures have similar beliefs. If you know, for example, the Hindu belief in karma, it's very similar. There's kind of a natural order of things which will out. For the Greeks, decay, ananke, necessity, serves the same role. For Anaximander, as Simplicius says, objects give recompense and pay restitution to each other for their injustice according to the ordinance of time. So there's kind of a cosmic courtroom, if you will, going on. Again, think about karma as kind of a rough analogy. What goes around comes around. There's going to be natural recompense. Although karma is a very different sort of notion, but the same general family of notions, I'm saying. Also, look, he's got a theory of evolution, Anaximander. In the beginning, man was generated from animals of a different species, namely a fish, inferring this from the fact that other animals come to eat on their own while man alone needs to be nursed for a long time. Well, man alone doesn't need to be nursed for a long time, but man needs to be nursed longer. You can wean a wild rabbit at 2 weeks. Domestic rabbit takes 4. What if we weaned our offspring at 2 weeks or 4 weeks? Well, they wouldn't survive. We have a rather long period of nurturance, even for vertebrate mammals, vertebrates and mammals. But interestingly, he does do some empirical observations. He says this, I've got some reasons in nature why I think this is the case, why this theory is true. Living creatures arose from the moist, being evaporated by the sun. In the beginning, man was similar to a different kind of animal, namely a fish. Well, we don't disagree with that also all that much today. The coelacanth, for example, the origin of terrestrial life from the seas. Yeah, so what goes around comes around. Maybe evolution has yet some more stages to go. Anaximander criticizes Thales. If the earth floats on the water of Oceanus, the great river, wouldn't something else have to contain the water? How does this happen? Instead, he says the earth is flat and it floats in space. The earth is like a column drum. We live on the top side, so it's flat, but it's extended. It's not just a thin disk. It doesn't rest on anything. It just hangs there. It's surrounded by a solid sphere. What appears to be the individual lights in the heavens, the sun, etc., is one great fire surrounding the sphere, and there are holes, vents of fire through which we see these things. So there's a picture of Anaximander's view. Think about a colander. If there were a big colander, one of those things you drain pasta in, a solid thing with holes, and there's a light behind it, and those, instead of the light being inside this fixture, it's outside and shining on the inside. That's the idea. And this explains for Anaximander at least the phases of the moon. The vent hole is gradually blocked and unblocked. That's why you have full moon, half moon, quarter moon, etc. It also explains eclipses. There are a number of ancient cosmologies which are like this. If you read, for example, the book of Genesis, the sky is talked about as the firmament. And when people read that today, maybe in church, whatever, they kind of pass over it. But the writer meant literally the sky was firm, the sky was solid. It was hard. It wasn't just, kind of airy space like we think it is today. The vents through which the fire shone for Anaximander were not exactly in a colander, but rather in rings around the earth that could change position. And here are a couple of depictions of those rings. Anthony Gottlieb has a slightly different metaphor. Think of it as an inner tube with punctures, and the inner tube is somehow staying inflated, but there are fires inside, and we're seeing the great cosmic fire through the punctures in this ring as it kind of goes around where we are. Now, what Anaximander says has interesting implications for the philosophy of science. This is Popper's point in his essay, Up the Pre-Socratics. Go back to Bacon. Remember the empiricist-rationalist controversy. Empiricism tells us that science is based on observational experience. And indeed it is today, but is it always throughout the history of science? Well, Bacon wants to quarrel with Aristotle precisely because Aristotelian science in so many cases clearly was not. We talked about this a little earlier. The earth might be flat. This is not a stupid idea. And observational evidence, at least from a certain limited vantage point, suggests to us that the earth is flat. Look at the horizon in lots of places on earth. Does it look like a basketball or does it look like a plate? It looks more like a plate. So empirical experience gives us this theory, the flat earth theory, not necessarily the best theory. Anaximander has a flat earth theory. The earth is a column drum we inhabit its flat top. What is it that keeps the column drum in place, just hanging there? Because the Earth is equidistant from all other bodies. Now, Popper notes there are a number of interesting features of this view. If one is inclined to think, with Bacon, that science comes from observational experience, well, Thales' theory does not, but Anaximander's critique of Thales does. Earth does appear empirically to be flat from a certain limited vantage point, from a certain point of view. If Earth is equidistant, though, there cannot be either top or bottom, up or down. So instead of a drum, Anaximander might have followed his own logic and taken the Earth to be a globe instead, a very unempirical theory, but a true theory. However, Anaximander didn't take it quite that far. What prevented Anaximander from arriving at the theory that the surface of the Earth was a globe rather than a drum? It was observational experience which limited him in that respect, says Popper. Taught him that the surface of the Earth was flat. Thus, it was a speculative and critical argument, the abstract critical discussion of Thales' theory, which almost led him to the true theory of the shape of the Earth. It was observational experience which led Anaximander astray. So that's rather an interesting take on observation and theory in the history of science. Anaximander says the circle of the sun is 27 times that of the Earth, that of the moon 18 times. And notice that the sun goes around the Earth for Anaximander, and the sun is the farthest thing out. The stars are closer than the sun. The moon is kind of in between. Okay, well, now he's just making up shit as he goes along. I mean, we know differently. We know better than that, and we know differently than that. The stars are farther out, the sun is closer. They don't all go around the Earth at the center. Was Anaximander the father of bogus statistics? Gilbert says, I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made up this one. Studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't any more useful than the ones you make up. How many studies showed that? 87. Well, Anaximander is making it up as he goes along. What Anaximander says about the flat bit of the Earth isn't untypical of the ancient view of cosmology. The Greeks saw Okeanos, the great river, as going around the Earth. Okeanos is the word from which we get our word ocean. Helios the charioteer, he was one of the Titan gods. We'll come and talk about the gods a little later when we come to talk about Socrates, but one of the older gods, drove the chariot across the sky each day, and the chariot was so powerful that even Zeus could not control the chariot. But Helios would take it up every day like this, and then it would come, new time it would be at the center, and then it would come down and go down in sunset, basically, and then the whole process would start all over again the next day. Here is Helios with his chariot on a Greek stamp. You know, the Greeks are so proud of their boys. This was the 1 drachma stamp back when they had their own currency, didn't use the euro. So basically, what would happen is at the end of the day, the chariot and Helios would get into a boat. The boat would go around Okeanos, around the flat Earth, and then start again at the rising point and go and do the same thing again. Go into the boat, go around during the night to the starting place, and again and again and again and again. Anaximander also gave us the first maps of the known Earth. It was a mental map. If you know this famous cover from the New Yorker, this is the New Yorker's view of the world. That is, it's a subjective sense of distance, not an objective one. So west of 9th Avenue, you find 10th Avenue. West of 10th Avenue, you find the Hudson. Everything else just kind of fades. You know, there's the great flyover zone, as people who travel from LA to New York like to call it. LA's out there somewhere, and Pacific Ocean's out there somewhere, and China's out there somewhere. But really, New York is the center. Manhattan is the center of it all. And this was the kind of ethnocentric cosmos that Anaximander had. Europe, Greece in particular, is at the center. There's the Mediterranean, the Middle Ocean, Libya, Asia, and Europe arranged around Greece. Here's a possible map of the world, the upside down map of the world. But why is it upside down? You know, if the Earth is a globe and it's one of many planets in one of many solar systems, again, is there any up or down? Why don't we draw Australia at the top rather than at the bottom? No good reason why we should do it one way rather than the other. Up and down is kind of arbitrary. Okay, That brings us then to the third Ionian, Anaximenes. Let me read the texts there. This is on page 13 if you have the full second edition, page 11 if you have our special edition. Anaximenes, he too being from Miletus, the son of Erystratus, said, "Boundless air is the source from which the things that are, were, and will be, and gods and divinities all come to be, and the rest come from the offspring of these. This is the character of air. When it is very uniform, it is imperceptible to sight, but it is discerned by being hot, cold, damp, or in motion. It is always in motion, for it would not undergo all the changes it does without moving. For being condensed or thinned, it changes its appearance. When it is dispersed to become thinner, it becomes fire. When, on the other hand, air is condensed, it becomes winds. And from air, cloud is produced by felting, process of making felt, by taking little tiny hairs, rabbit hairs, and clumping them together, make a felt hat, for example. From air, cloud is produced by felting. When it is condensed, still more water, still more earth, and when it is condensed as much as possible, stones. So the main contraries of generation are hot and cold. The earth is flat, riding on air. Likewise, the sun and moon and the other heavenly bodies, which are fiery, float on air because of their flatness. The heavenly bodies came to be from earth because of the moisture arising from it, which, being thinned, comes to be fire, and from fire, floating aloft, the heavenly bodies are composed. There are also some earthy natures in the place of the stars, which are carried around with them. He, Anaximenes, denies that the heavenly bodies move under the earth as others suppose, but he says they turn around the head like a felt cap. So turn around the earth like a felt cap around our head. Seems like felt. The sun is hidden not by going under the earth, but by being covered by the higher parts of the earth and by being greater distance away from us. The stars do not heat us because of their great distance. Oh, no, he's got something right here. The sun heats us, obviously, but the stars don't. They're farther away. The winds are generated when the condensed air is lifted up and carried along. Being collected and compacted still more, clouds are generated and thus turned to water. And hail is produced when water from the clouds is frozen as it travels downward, and snow when more moisture-laden particles are solidified. That's not bad. Lightning is produced when clouds are rent by the force of winds, for when they are rent, the flash is bright and fiery. A rainbow is produced when the rays of the sun fall on thickened air. These are the views of Anaximenes, who flourished around the first year of the 58th Olympiad, that is 548, 547 before the Common Era, and this once again is St. Hippolytus. The next passage. Or just as Anaximenes of old thought, let us not leave the cold or the hot in substance, but let us view them as common properties of matter which supervene on changes. For he says, Anaximenes, what is contracted and condensed is cold, what is thin and loose, using this very term, is hot. Hence, it is not inappropriate to say that man emits hot and cold from his mouth. For the breath is cooled when it is compressed and condensed by the lips, but when the mouth is relaxed, it becomes hot as it leaves the mouth because of being rarefied. And this, once again, is Plutarch. Okay. Thales said water is the basic element. Anaximenes said it's air. Earth, air, fire, and water. Those were our four ancient elements. Everything is air. It's just thick air or thin air. So via this process of felting, air becomes thicker. So the air we breathe is just thin air. When air gets thicker, it becomes water. If it gets thicker still, it becomes stone. That's the thickest air possible. But it's all air. So there's a matter of rarefaction. And when it's even thinner than the air we breathe, then it becomes fire. Rarefaction and condensation is kind of a dial there. But air is the basic substance of all things. Anaximenes' account of hail is kind of like ours, and so is snow. His account of lightning, not at all. Doesn't have the notion of electricity yet. Nobody did. Like Anaximenes, he says that it's the result of clouds being torn. No, it's not. But he doesn't say it's a result of Zeus throwing his fiery thunderbolts. So that's at least a step in the right direction. The earth floats on air, like Anaximenes said. The sun, though, doesn't sit below the edge of the earth, but it's obscured by the mountains. It goes behind the mountains. Okay, and here's a depiction. The earth is flat and it rides on air because of its flatness. The heavenly bodies turn around the earth like a felt cap around our heads. Maybe he had some observational background for this, and you can see this kind of thing happening if you have boiling water and the kettle lid kind of rises a little bit. I don't know if they had frisbees, but a flat object in motion can remain somewhat stable. Sometime before the Ionians came along, the Babylonians had developed astronomy, and the Ionians seem to have known a bit about this. Thales, for example, used Babylonian data probably when he predicted the eclipse. My friend Eric Price notes this. Above all, the Babylonians were able to make astronomical calculations without recourse, so far as we know, to any kind of geometrical picture or model diagram. The Greeks, the Presocratics, are starting to develop maps and models of the earth. That's an innovation. So they guess, but is all this ad hocness and guesswork really a bad thing? Well, here's the case for the prosecution, but there is a case for the defense. Clearly, regarding the substantive things that some of these guys say, the column drum, the earth, air, fire, and water, the geocentrism, etc., etc., these guys were quite innocent of what we would later come to call science. The idea of planet Earth in this picture is factually incorrect. The idea of planet Earth in this picture, which they didn't quite get to, is factually correct. But what is science? Is science a body of factual information, or is it a method of inquiry? If we think of it simply in terms of the results at which it has arrived over its long history, well, yes, these guys are clearly wanting. The flat Earth has problems that the round Earth does not. We see that there were some empirical aspects to the pre-Socratic cosmologies, but for the most part, they were wild and speculative. It's the latter wild guesswork which stands out most to us. Why the column drum and not the globe? Anaximander did make empirical observations, and according to Popper, again, that in a way was his downfall because he didn't go beyond the empirical observations to a better theory. So these guys were not non-empirical. Their views were a combination of observation and speculation. Science is empirical, but it's not just empirical. This is what Popper argues about Anaximander, after all. The Presocratics, though, started us on the path to progress by method, by asking the right questions. Bold guesswork is the hallmark and method of science, says Popper, so don't worry about getting things wrong. A false theory may be as great an achievement as a true one. Again, what does Einstein say? If I had an hour to solve a problem, my life depended on it, I would spend 55 minutes working out the right questions. I wouldn't worry so much about the right answer until the end. Things are not always as they seem. Anthony Gottlieb, in addition to empiricism, his account of the Presocratics, and it's a very good one, I highly recommend this. Two more features of science: to aim to be as simple as possible, and to recognize that there is indeed more to the world than meets the eye. That empirical observation can take us far, but only so far. Thales met feature number one, to be as simple as possible. He did so in several ways. First of all, everything is one basic substance. Secondly, what is that basic substance? Water. This makes simple sense in terms that water obviously and easily changes form. The same quantity of water could be solid, liquid, vapor. It's found in food, blood, and semen. When things dry up, they die. There were earlier cosmologies in which water was mystical or some personified deity, but Thales' water is just the ordinary water that we drink, what we see in the rivers, a naturally occurring substance, not a god, not a metaphor. Anaximander also met feature number one, but went beyond Thales. His apeiron is simple. Thales' water is simple too, but unlike Thales' water, is not an observable substance. It's an unobservable thing which underlies and thus explains all the observables. So Anaximander also met feature number two: science needs to get beyond what is merely empirically observable. In fact, as Gottlieb says, when Anaximenes comes along after Anaximander, he takes a step backwards. Like Thales, he too chooses a naturally occurring substance. Thales chose water, Anaximenes chose air as his basic element. So Gottlieb concludes the following. Today, these people are called the Presocratics, which marks the fact that nearly all of them had what some historians regard in the 19th century as the misfortune of having been born before Socrates. In fact, they were far from being a mere overture to the Socratic era. As Nietzsche said, they invented the archetypes of all later philosophy. They also invented science, which in those days came to much the same thing. Possibly the greatest achievement of the Milesians, the Ionians, was that they institutionalized for the first time in human history the practice of comprehensively critical rationalism. Typically, schools pass along dogma. Criticism isn't tolerated. If you study in a madrasa, if you study in a Confucian school, you do what the master tells you. You follow strictly and obey. In the Ionian school, students criticized teachers, as Anaximander did his teacher Thales. This doesn't happen without teachers encouraging this. This was new. With fits and starts, this is a tradition which has endured also, as Popper notes back to the Presocratics, conjectures and refutations. Now we come to Heraclitus. Heraclitus is an interesting character. We've already heard from him a bit previously, but let's go ahead and see. I'm not going to read the whole selection from Heraclitus, but the first two bits. First of all, the word, logos. Of this word, and the Greek word for logos is, for word is logos, sorry. Of this word being forever uncomprehending, do men prove to be both before they hear and once they have heard. For although all things happen according to this word, they are like the unexperienced experience in words and deeds, such as I explained, dividing each thing according to its nature and showing how it is. Other men are unaware of what they do when they are awake, just as they are forgetful of what they do when they are asleep. Collecting information does not teach understanding. Else, they would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, as well as Xenophanes and Hecataeus. Listening not to me, but to the word, it is wise to agree that all things are one. The world is ever-living fire. The world order, the same of all, no god nor man did create, but it ever was and is and will be, ever-living fire, kindling in measures and being quenched in measures. The turnings of fire, first sea, and of sea, half is earth, half fire wind. I have no idea what he's trying to say here. It's not just you. All things are in exchange for fire, and fire for all things as goods for gold and gold for goods. The road up and down, the course out and back, is one and the same. And this is the one we've heard before from him. I'm stepping into rivers, staying the same, other and other waters flow. Heraclitus says, I believe that all things march on and nothing stands still. And comparing things to the flow of a river, he says, you cannot step twice in the same river. This we get from Plato. As we get the following, all things move and are in flux. Collections, wholes, not wholes, brought together, pulled apart, in tune, out of tune, from all things one, and from one all things. They do not understand how differing from itself it agrees, back-turning connection as of a bow or a lyre. Anyone's guess. As the same thing in us as living and dead, waking and sleeping, young and old. For these things having changed around are those, and those in turn having changed around are these. Okay. Let's see if we can make heads or tails of any of this. Heraclitus, again, also from Ionia. He was from the town of Ephesus nearby Miletus. If you've ever read the New Testament, St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, this is the same, very same Ephesus. And by the way, Ephesus is definitely worth visiting if you're in that part of the world. Miletus, not so much. It's in pretty bad shape, but Ephesus is in better shape, and there are some archaeological digs going on there. When I was there, it's been 10 years ago now, there was a Roman apartment building that was being studied, and you could walk through it. There were plaster walls and tile floors, and you don't actually walk on the tile. There are wooden walkways, bridges sort of going, but you can walk through the building. And it's really quite a substantial apartment building, and see, and there are temples, and there's just a lot of stuff to see in Ephesus. So I would definitely, if you're there, and go to Troy because it's in the same general neighborhood, but certainly see Ephesus if the chance arises. Logos, the Greek word for word. I mentioned St. Paul. Has anybody ever read the four Gospels? There are the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're synoptic because they see more or less alike. They're drawn probably from the same sources. And then there's the Gospel of John, which of the four canonical gospels is way out in left field, of course. Only four gospels are canonical. There were a lot more gospels recounting the life of Jesus. The Gospel of St. Thomas, for example, Jesus decided he got pissed off at his playmates, and so he turned them into birds using his magical powers. I guess that wasn't thought to be sufficiently godlike, and so it didn't make the cut. It's still around. We can read it, but it didn't become part of the biblical text. St. John did, and it is very different from the other three, the synoptics. It begins in this way: "En arche en hologos, ka hologos en proston theon, kai theos en hologos." In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and with God, and the Word, and God was the Word. This comes straight out of Heraclitus, the notion that Word is the basis for all reality. In the beginning was the Word, and St. John identifies his God with that basic elemental thing. The notion that we can have magic words. We don't buy this anymore, but it has been very important throughout a lot of human history. The notion that you could speak a certain word, a magical word, and it would perform a physical action. Abracadabra, hocus pocus, children do this all the time. The word abracadabra actually comes from Hebrew, I create what I speak. Hocus pocus has a slightly different history. The Catholics and the Protestants differed over a number of issues during the Reformation, one of which was what happens in religious worship rituals. The Catholics have the Mass, and in the Mass, the priest elevates the bread, the host, and says the words, hoc est enum corpus meum, and then that bread magically changes to the body of Christ. Does the same thing with the wine. It magically changes into the blood of Christ. Accidents remaining, still looks like bread, still looks like wine, but substance changing, it really becomes something different because of the words. The words make this happen. The Protestants disagreed. They said, no. What the Catholics call the Mass, the Protestants often refer to as the Last Supper. They see it as a ritual, this do in remembrance of me, but they don't actually eat the flesh of Christ and drink the blood of Christ. That's just so much hocus pocus. That's where that comes from, the Protestants dissing the Catholic ritual. It's just hocus pocus. When Harry Potter's glasses break, Hermione takes her wand and says, oculus reparo, in Latin, and guess what? The glasses get fixed. So words can have physical effects. Words can also give power over persons. If you know the folktale Rumpelstiltskin, Rumpelstiltskin gets to claim the queen's first child unless she can get his name, and she goes into the woods to his cottage, and he's dancing around the fire. My name is Rumpelstiltskin. She'll never get it. Well, now she has it. And having his name, she has power over him. He cannot take her first child. If you are an Orthodox Jew, it is blasphemous to pronounce the name of God. The Tetragrammaton, as it's called, the four marks with the vowel points, which we transliterate in English as Yahweh. So Jehovah is an alternate version, older version of that. And Christians will say that, but if you're really an Orthodox Jew, you'll never say that. I mentioned the role of Scripture in Hebrew worship. Every Shabbos, somebody gets the honor, layman, of being able to read the text, and there's a special pointer, you can't touch the text, and you use the pointer to follow the Hebrew words because they go that way. And if and when you come to that name of God, you don't say it. You use a euphemism, the Holy One, blessed be He, and then you go on. Because this name of God is not just sort of a generic word, God. It is God's personal name. It's like God, calls to Moses in the burning bush and says, psst, psst, come here. I'm going to tell you my name, my personal name. My name is George, but don't tell anybody else. That's God's personal name. And so you don't speak it, because if you do, you're claiming power over God. Just like Rumpelstiltskin's queen had power over him once she got his name. And so you don't want to show God that you're trying to exercise power over him. He doesn't like that. God don't like, that kind of stuff. And so even today, if you're a pious Orthodox Jew, you will never, never, never say that sacred name out loud. You'll read over it in the text by using a euphemism, but not the word itself. Now, that's not our modern view of language. Ferdinand Saussure states the modern view, the connection between signifier and signified is arbitrary. Words are only arbitrary markers for the things they denote or point to. There is no intrinsic relationship between words and things. And so, of course, the whole notion of magic, for example, wouldn't work. But again, this was not always the view that people have held. In the Middle Ages, one of the interesting artifacts that survives, if those that survive are museum pieces today, are things called bestiaries. And bestiaries were books illustrated of animals. See, God gave Adam the power to name all the animals. And so the bestiaries try to figure out, why is it that the name that Adam gave to all the animals is the one and only one best word suited to each and every one of the animals that he set about to name? So, for example, Adam spoke Latin. Of course, we know this. Capra, the word capra is goat. Why is it that the word capra, above all other possible words, is the best word, and the only word really, to signify what goatness really is? Now, we kind of laugh at that for a couple of reasons. Did Adam speak Latin? Is there one and only one word in one and only one language which works best? No. The word capra can be translated in other languages, chèvre, in French, chivo, in Spanish, capra, in Italian, also tsiga in German, goat in English, aiga in Greek. As long as you're speaking the particular language in which that word fits, that word then picks out that thing which we call in English a goat equally well. And if you speak another language within the context, relative to the context of the language system that you're using, a word will work equally well as the corresponding word will work in another language system. There are no words that are better or worse. That's the modern view of language. But again, Heraclitus gives us a very different view of word. Word is very, very fundamental to the organization of reality. And there might even, for example, be magic words. There might even be intrinsic connections between words and things, bestiaries. The earth is melted into the sea by that same reckoning whereby the sea sinks into the earth. As all things change to fire, and fire exhausted falls back into things, the crops are sold for money spent on food. A lot of the things that Heraclitus says can be quite enigmatic, even obscure. Knowing many things doesn't teach insight. Well, that's not obscure. What does Heraclitus mean by that? Maybe he means one can be an educated fool or a schooled fool. Remember, schooling and education, not the same thing. Even if one is truly learned, one may still lack common sense, insight, metacognition, remember that, or some kind of higher order knowledge. Information doesn't mean understanding. The term he uses for knowing many things, polymathi, is the root of our word polymath. Our word's a complement. It's as close as we can get to a Renaissance man, but the Greek word connotes something else, the magpie. Magpies collected this and that fact, but lacks insight, lacks understanding, lacks any larger meaning. Hodos ano kato. The road up and the road down is one and the same. Well, sometimes that is the case. The road to victory, one president following another. What did Satchel Paige say? Be kind to those people you meet on the way up, because you may meet them again on the way down. The road may be the same. And of course, Heraclitus and his river, we talked about this before. A river is both a place and a process. The process is in constant change. The place is relatively constant. So he's really asking, isn't he, the relation between continuity and change. The Mississippi remains the Mississippi and not the Nile, but neither of them contain the same water that each of them did yesterday. They're different. In order for something to change, it has to remain the same. So a green leaf, for example, in spring and summer might change into a brown leaf in autumn, because Persephone has had to go back into Hades. Remember that story. But we don't say that the green leaf changes when we simply substitute a brown leaf for it. It's somehow the same leaf, but not the same leaf at one and the same time. The change from green to brown embraces opposites. At one and the same time, it's the identical leaf, it's not a different leaf, but one time it's green, another time it's not green. But if it's indeed identical, then how is it really also opposite? And if it's opposite, how is it really identical? That's a mystery. Here is someone who lived in Munich in 1962, and here's someone who went back to visit Munich in 2010. Hey, guess what? They're the same person. The person who holds this birth certificate, Cub Scout in 1962, took his associate's degree at Florida Keys Community College, Key West in 1973, and by 2010 has lost his hair and gotten a bit of a paunch. But same biography for all three of these guys. Like a river, a person is also a process, and it's not a place, but something we believe has a stable identity. But is this belief true? Is there such thing as personality? One could question that. Am I the same person now I was when I was 9 years old, when I was 20 years old? Will I be the same person 10 years from now? Pantarei, says Heraclitus, all is flux. The word ray means change, means flux. It's the root of our word rheostat, that's which to use to modulate electric current flow. Also the root word of our word diarrhea, that which flows through, dia, through. So basically Heraclitus is saying existence is continuous diarrhea, perhaps. In their different way, says Popper, the Milesians, Thales, Anaximenes envisioned the world as a kind of house, the home of all creatures, our house. But there's a difference between the Milesian message, there's a fire in the house, and Heraclitus' somewhat more urgent message, the house is on fire. Fire is the basis of all things. And it was not created by the gods, it was eternal. Does Heraclitus really think of fire as a thing like water, perhaps? We think of fire as a process of oxidation. It's not really a thing. It's something that happens when certain conditions are met. What Heraclitus does say about fire is puzzling and cryptic. The world order ever was and is and will be ever-living fire, kindling in measures and being quenched in measures. The turnings of fire, first sea and the sea, half is earth, half fire wind. All things are in exchange for fire, and fire for all things, as goods for gold and gold for goods. What could this possibly mean? Did Heraclitus, like Empedocles, for example, and to the other Milesians, think of fire as a basic element, or is the flux of fire just a metaphor for the overall flux of existence? Maybe Heraclitus simply meant existence is like fire. You can read Guthrie on this, if you will, pause and read it at leisure. Now, this is going to have some consequences down the road, because Plato's going to take up Heraclitus. Plato is going to see a challenge. If Pantarei, if all is flux, is there no continuity? The realm of the senses, the twilight world of change and decay about which Plato worries, is all flux. Will we find continuity? Maybe we need to look elsewhere than the twilight world of change and decay in order to find that continuity. That's what Plato's going to take up. Also, Heraclitus said something, I didn't actually read this. This is the passage I didn't read, but let me just read it now. We must trust in the common sense of all as a city trusts in its wall, and with even more trust, for all human laws are nourished by the one divine law. This is a view that's very weird in ancient times. It's going to come into its own in our own time, the notion of natural law and human rights, the notion of there being a law in nature which is over and above the positive law that we have in the city. But it's going to take a while for us to grasp that one. And now we move on to the Eleatics, those Presocratics who lived not in Ionia, in what's now Turkey, but who lived in Magna Graecia, what's now Italy. Elea was the home of Parmenides, also of Zeno of the Paradoxes. Let's look at Parmenides. I'm going to read some passages from him. We're on page 15 in the second edition. And this is kind of poetic, and this is a philosopher expressing himself in a way that probably no philosopher today would do, but it's worth having a look. Come now, and I shall tell, and do you attend hearing, which are the only two ways of inquiry for thinking. The one, that it is and that it is not possible not to be, is the path of persuasion, for she attends on truth. The other, that it is not and that it is right that it should not be, this, I declare to you, is an utterly inscrutable track. For neither would you know what is not, for it cannot be accomplished, nor could you declare it, that is expressed or pointed out. It is right to say and to think that whatever is, or it is right that what is for saying and thinking should be, for it is able to be, or it is for being, and nothing is not. These things I bid you consider. From this first way of inquiry I withheld you, but now from this one, which mortals knowing nothing wander two-headed, for helplessness in their breasts directs a wandering mind, and they are born both deaf and blind, dazed, undiscerning tribes, by whom to be and not to be are thought to be the same, and not the same, and the path of all men, or path of all things, is backward turning. And on he goes. Parmenides was the diametric opposite of Heraclitus. For Heraclitus, change and motion were basic. For Parmenides, motion was impossible. Everything in existence was a single, motionless, unchanging thing. So if Heraclitus says you cannot step into the same river twice, Parmenides, in fact, says you can't even step into the same river once. There's a basic contradiction in Heraclitus. Change is central. Despite change, opposites remain identical. The non-green leaf remains the same leaf as the green leaf, and yet they appear different. Well, change is not visible. If you think about it, change is something that is inferred intellectually. We don't actually see the green leaf change into the brown leaf, but we make the inference that it did. You don't see your children grow up. Just turn around, don't blink, and they're grown. You don't see the movement from one to the other. You see the one, you see the other, you make the inference that the child did grow. If opposites are identical and if change cannot be seen, then, this is Parmenides' point, isn't change just an illusion? This is exactly what he says. Remember Seinfeld? It's a sitcom about nothing. Parmenides says, literally, we cannot think of nothing. Why? Because if we try to think of nothing, we make it an object of thought, that is, we make it a something, and then it ceases to be nothing. So, until it's solved, what exists? Everything. What doesn't exist? Everything else. Since we cannot think nothing, it also cannot be. And since nothing cannot be, there cannot be any such thing as space. Therefore, everything that exists is one big solid object. And he added to that a belief that seemed obvious to the Greeks, probably not to us. The circle is the perfect geometric form in 3 dimensions. That would be the sphere, the perfect geometrical form in 3D. And therefore, everything which exists is one big solid ball. Now, this is not what our sense experience tells us, but our sense experience is wrong. Can you hear Plato coming down the pike here? Senses tell us that things are divided into land, air, water, people, all kinds of individual objects that we see. But in reality, everything is just one big undifferentiated sphere, one big entity. And individuality is nothing but false consciousness. I am he, as you are me, and we are all together. I look around and I seem to see different things, but tatvamasi svetiketu. Everywhere you look, you see yourself. There's no space between things, and there is no individuality. So it just looks like you're a different person than me, but we're really one and the same, or one and the same being. It looks like you have a different bank account, but it's really everybody's bank account. Don't try this at home, kids. Don't try this with my bank account. Everything's one thing. There are not many things. There's just one. Now, if this is true, then it follows that change cannot happen. One thing cannot change into its opposite. Green leaves cannot become non-green leaves. Children cannot become adults because there are no other things. Change is just as much an illusion as is individuality, and for the same reason. So Parmenides had a distinctive view about words and things. If you cannot name a thing, it cannot exist. Conversely, if you can name a thing, that means not only does it exist, but it must exist. How, he says, then, can what is be going to be in the future? If it came into being, it is not, nor is it if it is going to be in the future. Thus, is becoming extinguished and passing away not to be heard of. The thing that can be thought and that for which the sake of the thought exists is the same. For you cannot find thought without something that is, as to which it is to be uttered. Well, Additionally, there could be no becoming, because if there were, then something would had to have been something which it is now, which it now is not. So there can be no change. All is permanence. Russell makes an interesting comment on this. This is the first example in philosophy of an argument from thought and language to the world at large. Not going to be the last. Remember St. Anselm's argument for the existence of God, and also, for that matter, Sartre's argument against the existence of God. Or Zeno's argument that motion is impossible. All starts here with Parmenides. The essence of Parmenides' argument is this, and this is Russell's commentary also. When you think of something. When you use a name, it must be the name of something. Therefore, both thought and language require objects outside themselves, and since you can think of a thing or speak of it at one time as well as another, whatever can be thought of or spoken of must exist at all times. Consequently, there can be no change, since change consists in coming into being or ceasing to be. Of course, for Parmenides, that can't happen. Plato takes this as a big challenge. If it's all just one single solid ball, well, we seem to experience change. Why is that? We need to account for continuity, but we also need to account for change and for individuality. How can there be both change and permanence? Heraclitus tells us that there's change. Parmenides tells us that there's permanence. Can we possibly reconcile them? That's a big impetus for Plato. Okay, and the last thing to note about the Presocratics is that they start in the provinces. They start philosophy going there, but philosophy eventually moves from the provinces to Athens. Ionia was at the eastern end, Elea at the western end of the Greek world. Athens is right in the middle. It was at the height of its power in the 5th century. We're going to come back to this when we talk about Socrates. He grew up during this time. It was renowned for its democracy. It was renowned for its open-mindedness. It was, as Heraclitus said in his funeral oration, the school of Hellas. And with the dynasty of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, those 3 generations, it will become the city of philosophy. This started a bit earlier. Zeno and Parmenides are thought to have visited Socrates there. Gorgias, also the sophist, Anaxagoras moved there, although he later had to flee into exile. But there's a flip side to Pericles bragging about Athens being the school for all Hellas. Emily Wilson notes the sophists were foreigners. Gorgias was from Leontini in Sicily, from Elea basically. Protagoras from Abdera in Thrace, Anaxagoras from Clazomenae in Asia Minor and Ionia, Hippias from Elis in the western Peloponnese. This fact is going to make the Athenians potentially hostile to the sophists, a basic anti-immigrant prejudice. And since Socrates, although he was himself a native-born Athenian, puts on the airs of a foreigner and did more or less what the sophist foreigners did, nativist prejudice is going to come to bear on Socrates when at last he is put on trial. And let's look lastly at Anaxagoras, because this also is going to figure in the trial of Socrates. First philosopher to move from Ionia to Athens, he taught Pericles. He was a friend of Euripides, the playwright. His book, which no longer survives, apparently influenced Socrates to react by turning away from the study of nature to the study of man. Anaxagoras had a number of ideas. Let's see. Yeah, we'll kind of skip the readings. About cosmology and astronomy, including the following. The sun is a red-hot stone, larger than the Peloponnese. The moon is made of earth, has mountains, and is inhabited. Like the sun, the stars also are hot stones, but we don't feel their heat because they're so far away. Okay, the sun is a red-hot stone, and it is larger than the Peloponnese. What's the Peloponnese? Peloponnese is that bit of Greece here circled in red, includes Sparta and Mycenae, one of the original Greek civilizations, along with Crete, or Knossos. Also Olympia, when the Olympian Games were first held, and Corinth. It's just to the west of Athens. It's fairly big, but not all that big. The sun is much bigger. It's considerably bigger than the Peloponnese. Now, go back, think about Helios. Helios, the sun god, and his sister Selene, the moon goddess. She had a chariot also, drove it at night. Anaxagoras doesn't buy this. He has a materialist explanation of these things. He says the sun is a stone, the moon is made of earth. This flies in the face of Greek religion because the sun and the moon were held to be gods. And we're going to hear this again when Socrates is put on trial, because Socrates' accuser Meletus is going to tag Socrates with holding views like this. Socrates says to him in court, "Do you mean that I believe neither the sun nor the moon to be gods like other men? I swear he does not, judges. He says that the sun is a stone and the moon earth." "Oh, Meletus, this is preposterous. Do you think you're prosecuting Anaxagoras, who does say these things, or are you prosecuting me, Socrates, who doesn't?" So this is going to come up. However, it happened before in a prelude to Socrates' trial for irreligion about 450 BCE, and Anaxagoras too was put on trial. Heraclitus, his friend, who spoke in his defense, told him, "Get out of town, go into exile," which he did. He was convicted in absentia and would have been put to death had he been remaining in Athens. As a result, astronomy was banned from Athens, the city of philosophy. So clearly then, Anaxagoras was a materialist, and he gave some very specific accounts of the material composition of the heavenly bodies, but he also said something somewhat different, which will also be influential on later philosophy. Nous is and rules all things. What is nous? Well, remember the word logos was the Greek word for word. Nous is the Greek word for mind, intellect. So Anaxagoras is also saying that matter is mind. And this has several key implications. First of all, if the very structure of the universe is mental, then we might hope for a rational understanding of nature. Secondly, things may be made up really of ideas. And thirdly, we may look to the process of events as the unfolding and development of a cosmic mind. Plato and the idealistic tradition onward are going to take up the second notion that things may be made up of ideas. That's going to be a very key concept. By the time we come to Hegel, we'll see this notion of progress in history come about, something Anaxagoras lacked, but Anaxagoras got that whole ball rolling. Nous initiates the physical world. In other words, mind and matter are not unrelated, and mind is prior to matter. This was the start of a long tradition in philosophy known as idealism. And now we'll mention Pythagoras. Pythagoras, interesting guy, also influential on Plato. Pythagoras was the guy that discovered that musical notes had a mathematical meaning. You could shorten a string by a precise ratio, and that string would produce different musical tones. So objective math, rather than subjective preference, makes up music. This applies today. If you play a guitar or any stringed instrument, but a guitar is a stringed instrument that has frets, you press down the strings and it shortens the string by a certain precise relationship. As the string touches the fret, the frets are set at precise mathematical intervals. In fact, you could even build a guitar, if you're not a musician, just by knowing the math. If you build a guitar in such a way you put the frets at the right places, then any musician who knows how to play a guitar can pick up that guitar and play it perfectly well. All you need to know is math. You don't really need to know music in order to build it. Now, to play it's a different thing. Number is a property of mind which human reason can grasp, but it also seems that rational number is a property of nature and matter. And that's not obvious, but it does seem to be the case. Pythagoras was so impressed by this, he went on to establish a whole metaphysics based on this insight. If you've ever heard the phrase, the music of the spheres, that comes from Pythagoras. He thinks that really the substance of reality is math and music. Okay, so we've seen how logos, Heraclitus' notion, was one thing, and number, Pythagoras' was quite another. Number has worked out for us. Word has not, as a basic understanding of how nature is composed and how it operates. Like Parmenides, Anaxagoras rejected the possibility of becoming. Unlike Parmenides, Anaxagoras accommodated the idea of change. Change occurs not when some new thing becomes, which is impossible for Parmenides, but when pre-existing stuff gets separated and differentiated. So for example, colors. Everything contains all color. Colors can be differentiated from that. the principle of predominance, as this is called. And I'm just going to kind of skip over this. Black is present in white, white is present in black. The same things about weight. Light is mixed with heavy, and heavy is mixed with light. Now, this is a kind of language which we found kind of weird. The light, the heavy, as if these things are things. Remember what Aristotle said of Thales: the hot itself arises from and lives off moisture. Heraclitus seems to treat fire also as a thing. We're going to encounter the same sort of thing in Descartes. It's an old view which we don't hold anymore. We have very different ways of thinking about heat and cold. But it's a set of ideas which is going to continue for a long time. And once again, can we really fault past thinkers for not knowing physics as we do? We have the benefit of standing, as Newton put it, on the shoulders of giants. They did not. Although, you know, we're going to see, Isaac Newton does this, that some of these older insights do have some applicability later as well. Okay, so let's sum up the Presocratics before we go on. Weird guys. We only know them through fragments, and this stuff, some of the stuff that they say is quite obscure. The Presocratics, though, remain important insofar as they were the first ones to ask questions about nature. They did so without reference to mythology and the gods. Yes, they made up some ad hoc stuff, some top-down speculation rather than bottom-up empiricism, although there was an empirical side to them as well, although that didn't always work out for the best. They're hard to interpret because we can read them only in fragments. Alas, we don't have the full works of the Presocratics. We have really only choppy little bits. And the fragments are often secondhand at centuries removed, sometimes reported by hostile witnesses. Now, when we get to Plato, and that's our next series of readings, we're going to find the opposite is the case. Socrates wrote nothing. We only know about Socrates because other people wrote about him, primarily Plato, also Xenophon, some other people to a lesser extent. But we think that we have in existence now everything that Plato ever wrote. There's no reference to Plato in any of the ancient literature that does not correspond to a work that we have still today. So it's like night and day. The Presocratics are so fragmentary. Plato, we have a pretty good collection. And that's what we'll take up when we come back again and look at, first of all, the dialogue by Plato known as Euthyphro. So this concludes my talk today on the Presocratics. Thank you, and good day.